We're live.
Morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening. My name is Tim Black. I am a contributor in the MakerDAO community here, serving as an interim host for our community call. This weekend, we have an exciting guest. Sébastien is going to talk about his MIP 13 for a strategic reserves fund, which should be exciting. He has a presentation, so hopefully we'll get that up here on the screen for everybody and later in the YouTubes. As always, these hopefully happen on Tuesdays, so I'm excited to be here and get this whole thing going. So I'm going to ping our host and see if we can't get Sébastien on screen. Bonjour. Welcome.
So I can start now?
I believe so. You should be able to hover on your face, and then there's a little share screen icon.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
So is that okay for you?
Looks good to me.
Okay, so the strategic reserve fund is a MIP 13 I've set in July, back in July. It was accepted. The motivation behind that was that there was a discussion about having a treasury for Maker since at least January 2020. And there was a lot of objectives. So keep in mind that I was writing this proposal in July. So we had a big issue with the peg. The price of DAI was quite far from $1. So my main reason was to find a solution to solve the peg issue. Currently, the peg is no longer an issue, but the treasury and strategic reserves can still be used for many things. The first one is to cover operational expenses. So as you all know, Maker is in the process to be autonomous, so to pay for people that are working for the DAO and not relying on the foundation for the next 5, 10, 20 years. So we need to have somewhere to store some DAIs to be able to pay people that are working on the project. Because even if you are not making any revenue, people are still expected to be paid, at least most of the people. The second objective can be to increase the DAI utility by using the capital from the strategic reserves or the treasury to improve the DAI ecosystem. Again, back in July, as ETH DAI pair on Uniswap didn't add a lot of capital, so a big swap from ETH to DAI or from USDC to DAI was quite expensive. Currently, it's still better, but maybe that's something that we can improve to improve the value of DAI to our customers. And again, another motivation is to provide a revenue stream uncorrelated to DAI stability fees. So currently, most of the revenues of Maker comes from the stability fees. So we charge people to give them some DAIs. But sometimes, like it was in July, we didn't make any revenue. So stability fees were flat at zero because we tried to increase the amount of DAI in the system, and we didn't make any revenue from that. If we have some strategic reserves, we can use some of the capital to provide the capital to liquidity pool on Uniswap to do a lot of stuff that can generate revenues for the protocol. So even when DAI is doesn't bring revenues, we can still make some revenues. And the last motivation was to avoid the issuance of MKR token at low price. Why is that? Because as we have seen in the Black Thursday, when you need to increase the supply of MKR token, because you need to pay for bad debt, because you have some loan issues, you need to issue MKR token to get money to pay back for those bad debts. Usually the market price is not high. When everything is fine, the market price is high. And when everything is bad, the market price for Maker is very low. So sadly, the current state of the system is that we are buying back Maker token when everything is good, when we are making a lot of revenues, and we are issuing Maker token when we really need to have some monies and we have problem in our systems. So keep in mind that everything in this discussion, in this presentation, is open for discussion. It's still an early AD, and it's important to have all the community to be in line to decide what is best for Maker. So obviously, when you think about having some treasury or some strategic reserves, you can think of the surplus buffer, which is kind of there for that. How does it work? First, it gets filled with DAI that are generated from the interest. So all customers, when they borrow some DAI, they pay an interest. And it goes to the surplus buffer. So the surplus buffer currently, if I'm correct, is 4 million DAIs. So up to 4 million DAIs are stored in this buffer. We can, the protocol and the Maker holders can decide to take some DAI from the surplus buffer to pay for expenses or whatever. And when the buffer is full, the system automatically buy and burn some MKR token with the DAI that are in the system, in the surplus buffer. And sadly, the worst case is when the buffer is empty and we still need some capital because we have some bad debt, then we issue MKR token and we get some dilution for Maker holder. So what are the issues of the system? So first, in case of emergency shutdown, the whole surplus buffer is given to DAI holder. That means that if there is a big crash, a big problem, and there is an emergency shutdown, Maker doesn't have any money left to restart the whole system. And that's not a big deal when you have the foundation behind you, because the foundation is here to help you. But if the foundation is out of the picture, like it will be maybe in 5 or 10 years, how do you restart a system when you say to all people contributing to Maker that you have paid them last month, that telling them that, okay, guys, you will not be paid this month. Thanks for your work. Please continue. Yeah, that's a bit difficult. The second problem is that if the surplus buffer is too big relative to the DAI market cap, it incentivizes the DAI holder to ask for an emergency shutdown. So because the surplus buffer belongs to the DAI holders, if there is an emergency shutdown, it all goes to the DAI holder. So if the surplus buffer is big, you might want to say, okay, there is a lot of money in Maker. I want my money back because I know that with the surplus buffer, I will not get $1 per DAI, but maybe $1.05, $1.10, whatever. And that starts to be interesting to ask for an emergency shutdown. And the last point is that it contains only DAI. So the bigger the surplus buffer is, the more intensive the pressure on the DAI price, because we are storing a lot of DAIs in the surplus buffer, and that doesn't help with the DAI price and the peg. Let's discuss briefly about the economics of MakerDAO. So Maker has some revenue streams. The main one currently is the stability fees. The main one, and I think the only one currently. Soon we will have the PSM spread. So people will buy and sell DAI, and we will make a bit of a spread there. Maybe also we will have some kind of investment, because I think that with the PSM, there is a discussion to use compound to store the USDC we will get, so that will be a bit of interest there. And oracles that maybe in the future, we will be paid from people that are using oracles. But we also have some expenses. The most regular one is the workforce. So currently we don't pay anyone because it's the foundation, but with MIP 14, there is the beginning of a process to pay for the workforce and for the contributors. For instance, the source grid. If you want to pay governance to be active in the forums, you have to pay them. And the second part of the expenses is when we have some kind of bad debt. For instance, ETH price decreased a lot in 1 hour. We have to liquidate a lot of vaults, and we might lose some money there. And this means that at some point we need to have money to fill the gap between the price we get from ETH and what we need to pay to sustain the DAI system. And obviously, the bigger issue is that nothing guarantees that the timing of revenues match the timing of expenses. You need to pay your workforce every month, or else the workforce might leave, but you don't make stability fees every month. There is some good months, like currently, we are making a lot of money every month, but sometimes, like 6 months ago, we don't make any DAI per month. So there is kind of a mismatch between the revenue you have and the expense you have. So you need some kind of buffer to control that. And that's one of the main ideas behind the strategic reserves. So to present something based on accounting, so on the left side, you have the DAI credit system as it's working now. You have all the vaults, the ETH, USDC, wrap Bitcoin, and the rest. At the bottom, you have the surplus buffer, which is filled with some DAI. And on the liability side, we print some DAI, which is our currency, and we say that for every DAI, we will keep $1 of assets. Currently, we have more than $1 of assets, so we have some kind of equity, which is the wealth behind one Maker MKR token. So currently, there is only the left side of the system. When the surplus buffer is full, we buy and burn some Maker token. In the next step, there is two additions. There is one post and one new addition, which is the flapper distributor, which is at the top of the middle section, which is a way to distribute money in excess from the surplus buffer. So it remains the same until the surplus buffer is filled. But when it's full, the money goes not to buy and burn Maker token, but it goes to the flapper distributor. And from there, it's just an illustration. We don't know really what will happen, but we can say, for instance, that we will use the money to make an operational buffer. So let's, for instance, have enough money on the side to pay for 3 months of expenses. So we are quite safe that we have some liquid cash to pay for expenses, workforce, oracles, and all the stuff. And for the rest, which is kind of the operating profit. So when the operations buffer is full, everything goes to the operating profit. And we can decide that we will use half of the amount to buy and burn MKR token and half of the amount to put in the strategic reserves. And every time you put one DAI in the strategic reserve, it increases the value of the Maker holders. Obviously, the strategic reserves can be used to buy and burn Maker token or to pay Maker dividend. That's what you see at the bottom of the middle section. But you can store those reserves by many ways, and it's an open discussion to know how we will use it. You can either just say, play the safe side and say we will store only as DAI because we trust DAI and it's safe and it's great. You can decide that, oh, maybe we want to store it as ETH because probably the ETH price will increase in the future. it's it makes sense because we are based on Ethereum, so it makes sense to store the reserve at ease. But you can also decide to do some yield farming to provide a DAI liquidity pool or Maker liquidity pool. That's possible as well. We can make some community development, maybe to add some tokens or some capital, for instance, of XDAI, which is a layer 2 protocol on top of Ethereum that is based on DAI. We might say that, okay, we like the fact that there is a L2 protocol that is based on DAI, so we will help them by putting some money there and making probably a yield as well. But the yield is not the main reason we would do that. Because every time DAI has more value, it's good for Maker because we increase the market share of DAI. We can also do some strategic investment. For instance, investing in, I don't know, a startup or protocol that is developing a wallet for South America, because for some reason, or a new L2 protocol because it's good for Maker to have some ways to influence the process of the protocol. Or, and this is the last possibility, to invest in some real world assets, because we might say that, okay, we have some kind of money and we want to keep it somewhere, but we want to generate some interest on that. And maybe we want to invest in the real world because it's uncorrelated with all the crypto assets that we have already on our balance sheet. And obviously, the idea here, you see that the strategic reserve are quite big compared to the DAI credit system. But the overall idea is the strategic reserve, at least in my understanding, will be something like between 1 and 10% of the DAI market cap. So still something small. Something just enough to, if there is a big issue on one asset, for instance, if a USDC crash, we might survive without deleting Maker token holder too much. And something like between 1 and 10% is what most banks are using in the real world. So let's speak a bit about solvency. So solvency is the fact that we keep our promise that behind every DAI there is $1 of value. This is the main promise of Maker to the DAI holder, and we need to ensure that it's the case. So basically, we are a bank because DAI are kind of a deposit account or some kind of notes on Maker. And people expect that assets are greater than the DAI liabilities. So it's another way of saying that for every DAI, we have $1 of assets, at least. With the assets, we are making loans, which are risky. You might think that making a loan in ETH is not risky, and most of the time it's not, because we are localized. So we ensure that our clients have more ETH value than the loan we are providing to them. But sadly, as we have seen earlier this year, but sometimes we still lose money, and sometimes a lot of it. Obviously, the more we take risk on the asset side, so on the loan we provide and the collateral we use to guarantee this loan, so that can be VRAP BTC, it can be USDC, so higher the return for Maker holder. For instance, we have one vault that is working quite well, which is Wi-Fi, with a 4% interest rate. That's great for us, but maybe Wi-Fi is quite risky because the volatility is high. And we will see. Obviously, the higher the risk, the higher the probability of insolvency. So the fact that we broke a promise to the DAI holder, that behind each DAI there is less than $1, and equity is a buffer to avoid that and take more risk. So the bigger the buffer, the equity, or the strategic reserve we have, the more risk we can take lending process. So, for instance, we can say that, okay, we can lend some DAI for ETH, but maybe we can reduce the debt ceiling and increase the stability fees to make more money, taking more risk, but making more money. And basically what we need to balance is the revenue we want to get and the buffer or the equity we have. There is one point where we have the most revenue we can get with the least equity. And we need to find this position because it's the best position for Maker, where we are making the most of the money with lower risk. One kind of solution is to increase diversification. For instance, with real-world assets, we can increase risk exposure without having to increase the buffer because it's uncorrelated. The risk is not correlated between the real estate in USA and the price of ETH. At least we can expect those two assets to be uncorrelated. And one thing that is important is that the buffer, so strategic reserve or whatever kind of buffer we want to have, doesn't mean that it's only cash sitting idle somewhere. It's just to have equity, to have some buffer, but we can invest this money to create more value. So it should be value-adding assets. It can be in the kind of yield generating or community development. So how does that work? So I suggest that the strategic reserves are separated from the DAI credit system. So it survived an emergency shutdown because it's great to add some reserve, but we don't want to lose them if there is an issue with the DAI credit system. It should be probably managed by a new governance contract. Probably not the same. I'm not sure about the technicalities of that, but different contract to govern the strategic reserve, but keeping the same governance rules. So every time you want to do anything with the strategic reserves, there is an executive vote, and all Maker token holders will vote on that, and if it doesn't pass, nothing changes. But that lead to some questions. First, what is good risk appetite? We are still quite young in the journey, and we don't really know what risk means in the context of Maker. But do we want more risk and more reward and having the possibility to lose everything? Or should we prefer to keep the risk low, even if that means that we get less money? And the second question is, how can we leverage the strategic reserves to increase the value proposition of Maker? So that can be to invest in other protocols, that can be to provide capital like liquidity pools to increase the value of DAI to users, or the liquidity of Maker, stuff like that. So just to keep some key takeaways, I think that as we grow, we need reserves because we don't want to lose everything the next time there is a big crash in the market. We did survive earlier this year, but now the DAI market cap is quite bigger, so the loss will be higher as well. We will have to pay for people and for stuff, so we need to match operational expenses with revenues and have a buffer to be able to meet both ends. And more importantly, I think we need to avoid Maker death or massive dilution. Because currently, and I think most people will agree that it's most likely that as we are the leader, we are in a Maker community code, so I can say that, we are the leader in DeFi, there will always be some people to invest in Maker, but we are not sure of the price. And it's possible that this can say that you have a big loss, let's say 100 billion DAI to recover bad debt, and they can say that, okay, we will invest, but every MKR token will be $1 or 1 DAI. So that means that the current maker holder will lose almost everything. And I'm quite sure we want to avoid that. The second key takeaway is that reserves doesn't mean it's idle cash. It should be yield generating one way or another. And capitalist power, that's we are still living in a capitalist system. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening, and if you have some questions.
Yeah, there's a couple in the chat, and I came with a few. So first off,
Right.
thank you, Sebastian, for putting that together. That's awesome. We'd probably want to share that presentation to the forum, Reddit, all the different community channels, because the illustration of the dependencies on the Flapper distributor would be
Yeah.
really nice. Like anything that's illustrated, that helps me, so I can only assume how much it helps other people. So
Yeah, sure. I will do that.
yeah, that'd be cool. I also think that that diagram just will help people discuss like what do they consider the assets they want to include in the fund.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, which that's one of the things I'd love to unpack. But first, there's a question from the chat, which is with 5 billion DAI outstanding and a 20 million stability surplus buffer, what would you see as a healthy sized strategic reserves fund?
What did you say at the beginning? 5 million DAI? Oh, it's in the chat.
Yeah, it's in the chat. So, like in the future, let's say we 5x where we're at right now.
Oh, 5 billion, yes.
Yeah.
I would say, I'm not sure. There is still some work to do about that. It will be a task after the risk. But usually banks, depending on the risk they take in the loans, should keep around 3% of the asset of the loans as equity. So yeah, it will be. I will say 3%, but it really depends. I mean, it's not the same. For instance, the current debt ceiling for ETH is 1.5, 150%, and we take we charge 2%. Currently, there is a ETHB vault type that has a lower liquidation ratio, collateral ratio, and a higher stability fee. So it's a bit more risk, but you get more reward. And obviously, it's not the same. I mean, you don't need any reserves if you put the debt ceiling of the liquidation ratio of ETH to 1,000%. There is almost no risk. But it's unlikely that we will generate a lot of DAI with that. So if you want to decrease the liquidation ratio and increase the stability fees, you need more reserves. And the cool thing about reserves is that as you add more type of risk, more collateral type, you can increase the risk of each collateral type and decrease the amount of reserve you need for the same risk.
Right on. Another question from the chat is, there an initial proposal for what the reserves fund, what those assets break down to?
Yeah, no, because at the time, so it was in July, the main idea was to solve the PEG issue, and mainly the idea was to sell DAI, because we don't want to have any DAI. So at the end, it would be just like the USDC vault, except of having 400 million of USDC vault, we would have strategic reserves of 400 million of USDC. So that was the idea, because the PSM was not possible at the time, and it was kind of a manual PSM.
Right. Yeah, sorry, I was just reading some of the chat questions. So yeah, I mean, geez, which question to go to? So I think there's the addition of the Flapper distributor is sort of newer, right? And it seems like these two have like this pretty, I wouldn't say a dependency, but they just come together really well. So it seems to me like some of the next steps are articulating what dependencies are needed from either like risk or smart contracts, because there was that discussion. So I'd love to unpack some of those that you sort of know, knowing what we know now as opposed to in July when this came
Yeah.
up, if that sounds reasonable. So do you want to just sort of articulate like some dependencies that you noticed?
Yeah, sure. So in July, it was not clear how we would seed the strategic reserves. Maybe it was from the foundation or whatever. But now we have some nice way to do that by using the DAI generated from the surplus buffer with a flapper distributor, which is a new idea to just one piece after the surplus buffer that can dispatch. It's just to dispatch the DAI flow. And we can, if we say that the flapper distributor use 100% of the excess DAI to buy and burn maker, it doesn't change anything compared with what we have today. But the cool thing is that we can use not 100% to buy and burn maker, but to do other stuff. And for instance, I suggest that we put half of the generation to the strategic reserves, but that's open for discussion. And for instance, I know that Wi-Fi, and there was the same proposal in the flapper distributor, to use some proceeds of the maker fees for charities like Bitcoin and stuff like that. Which is, I think it's a cool idea as well, because when you generated some revenue, maybe you want to give a part of the revenues to the community to ensure the development of the ecosystem.
Yeah, Frank had some questions about helping to develop the ecosystem. He was also curious about investments, right? So not just thinking of real world assets, but thinking of real world projects. We're going to be out there. I mean, I would assume obviously we'd have to be like crypto native, right? So getting an investment from an automated contract already is kind of cutting edge. So he just wanted to unpack how you sort of envision that kind of thing working. I mean, obviously we'd be pretty manual. You need humans as intermediaries to sort of set up investment contracts. But did you have any sort of thoughts on how this reserves fund would make those types of investments?
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be manual. I mean, we can develop some smart contract to manage the strategic reserves automatically and just give them some parameters. And one thing I discovered just today, so the presentation is not up to date, is that we are already doing that, because when we are creating a vault or letting people create a vault, we are making a loan to some people. It's just the same. So we can use the strategic reserve to make the same kind of loan for anything. So currently, I'm not sure what is the best. There is one thing in terms of risk. We want to invest in stuff that where we cannot create a vault currently, because if we can create a vault for collateral, it would make more sense to create a vault. But for stuff that we want to experiment, or stuff that are not possible to use as a vault, for instance, if we want to invest in the stock market in the US, we cannot really create a vault, but we can do that with the strategic reserves. Not sure it's a good idea, but that can bring diversification to the risk we are taking with the vault in Maker. And by increasing the diversification of risk, we are increasing the risk reward, the real reward risk of the whole protocol. So increasing the value we generate for our token holder and diminuing the risk, or at least for the same risk. And one point that is, I think, the most important one for strategic reserves is there is a lot of use to increase the value of Maker and DAI by providing some DAI liquidity pool. Can be on Curve, because Curve wasn't there in July. Now on Curve, or I don't know where, or for instance on layer 2 protocols. If there is a new shiny layer 2 protocol with a Uniswap clone on it, we can put a lot of DAI in this Uniswap-like L2.
Mm-hmm.
And so that for this L2 network, DAI is the main token to use because there is a lot of liquidity.
Yeah,
I think it will be better than using USDC everywhere, or USDC or USDT.
Yeah, I mean, reducing centralization risk, good.
Exactly.
That's a great idea. And I'm sure everybody would agree that, increasing DAI liquidity out there is always a good thing. I did want to
strategic, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. For strategic investment, I think it would make sense to invest. I don't know if there is a startup I'm thinking of that because I know that we have a lot of DAI user in South America, but not sure there is a nice wallet, or I'm quite sure there is a lot of startups that are developing tools to use DeFi. But maybe we can make an investment there and help them to bring the network and to bring DAI, obviously, to their user.
Yeah, I mean, definitely showing my own bias. I think, investing in teams that are increasing DAI usage and DAI liquidity in different places is one of the mandates that community development is into.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's definitely some synergies there. We could probably add some data or some case studies. There's currently a pilot that's running with some folks in the LATAM area, and they're basically creating, DAI users from scratch pretty much, which is would basically lead to deal flow for the strategic reserves, which would be kind of cool to see how that would kind of come together. Frank asked about tax implications, but I think that's we should probably get the updated strategic reserves idea of what's going to go in the reserves before we start talking about how the DAO talks to whatever.
That will be an issue anyway, because when we are having revenues, we probably need to pay taxes. But currently, let's say we live in the DeFi world and there is no taxes in the DeFi world.
Yeah, maybe we should keep one of the assets as taxes when you can actually tax a DAO.
Yeah,
just leave
maybe
it there.
Yeah, no, but it's not it's a good point, because at some point maybe we will have IRS or whatever tax services to ask us to pay.
Yeah, I mean
and that's possible.
Or
and it will be better to have the money.
Yeah,
or to just to have some legal charge, some legal issues, and legal cost a lot of money. So it would be better to have some kind of money to defend ourselves, or to lobby in Washington.
Yeah, totally. There's actually some questions in the chat. The first one is, what are the main objections, or what's the bearish case for having a strategic reserves fund?
Well, the main objection could be that we want something pure. We don't want to have to do stuff manually, or to make stuff complicated, or to have too much governance. Because obviously, if you have some strategic reserves, you increase the governance side of things. But I'm quite sure everyone will agree that we already have a lot of governance work. Just by seeing the forum, there is always plenty of stuff. But I mean, if this is the main objection, I'm quite sure we don't want to do a real world asset neither, because it's a lot of complexities and it's a lot of work as well. And we don't want to have employees of the DAO. It's one thing to be a protocol which is with a high intensity of governance and work, and it's another to be something like Uniswap. If everyone Uniswap will live in the future, Uniswap V2 or even V1 still work, and without any governance, it will still work for I suppose a lot of years. But I'm quite sure if Maker governance disappear tomorrow, Maker will probably not be used in 1 year, because we have a lot of decision to make every time to stabilize the peg, or every time there is a new issue to solve.
Yeah, someone posted a chart on the forums of how often we have to deal with governance issues, it being every week. So I would agree, although it seems like everyone's working really hard to automate it. So I think possibly one of the biggest strengths to this reserves fund is that you see it as this either module or like whole separate contract that's mostly automated, like kind of the way Yearn Strategies works. It's
Yeah,
strategically investing liquidity, and then it's also thinking through the different parameters of anything that does require a vote so that there's less overhead. That to me sounds like a strength, not an objection. But
yeah, and we can invest all the strategic reserve in Yearn, for instance. Yearn Vault. Makes sense. Yearn is an asset manager, so we don't have to do it ourselves.
yeah, exactly.
But
There's
we have
there's
to
plenty.
believe in Yearn. So maybe we will need to buy some Wi-Fi token to have an impact on governance first.
Totally. Another question from the chat is what is the initial funding proposal? I think they're asking about the distributor. It's 50-50, right? 50 to buy and burn and 50 to
There is
reserves.
currently no proposal.
Oh,
I think 50-50 makes sense. But yes, it's just an opinion, and I'm quite sure we will have some kind of ranked vote or whatever. The kind of vote that doesn't pass because it's too complex. Yeah, I think 50-50 is nice. And obviously, the strategic reserves, you should limit them. To, it's not something that you will put money for perpetuity. At some point, you need, okay, the risk of insolvency of the system is low. Let's buy and burn some Maker token or distribute ETH to Maker holder.
right. So it's meant to be like active capital then, almost always, rather than just gradually filling and we forget to do something with it.
Yeah, it will take. It depends. Yeah, on it's really to have some kind of threshold, and what is above that should be spent.
That makes sense.
Because again, we try to optimize the risk reward. So if there is not much risk, we don't need the big reserves. Maybe sometime we will have to reduce the reserves.
Right. So there's kind of these balanced scales, right? Like where the risk and reward is going versus where the ecosystem is pushing on DAI as a whole, and well, the DAI credit system, right?
Yeah,
So like there's times where we want to lever up because like it's pretty safe to put more capital to work, and then there's other times where we're gonna have to turn it off. And you're saying you want that to be more automated than governance overhead?
well, yeah, because if you can, I'm quite sure Primoz has a lot of ideas to evaluate the risk of the whole system,
Yeah,
and,
I'm sure.
and you can try to define what is the maximum loss you can have for 99.999% of the time, and you want to the strategic reserve to be this number. So if the model gives something else, maybe you want to increase or decrease the buffer. And obviously, the governance can decide to take more risk, to be more greedy, and then you might want to increase the buffer or not. That's up to the governance anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you think of any examples that manage treasuries in this way out in the DeFi space or somewhere else in crypto?
I know that Wi-Fi is doing that. They are giving, I think it was, so to include the Flapper distributor as well, they are giving 1% to Bitcoin. And they are investing those reserves. They have invested a lot of their ETH in Alpha Mora, which is a DeFi protocol that has a good yield on ETH. And yeah, I'm not sure why Wi-Fi Yarn has some treasuries, but probably there is a reason.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure they gave it as much thought as you did. It's just, it seems like a forward thinking thing, right? there's going to be people that you need to pay. There's going to be things you want to invest in. There's going to be capital you want to put to work. We assume the DeFi ecosystem will grow. So it just kind of makes
exactly.
sense.
And sometimes you have good times and sometimes it's bad times.
Yeah.
And if you don't have money when it's bad times, it's end of the game, usually.
Yeah.
And we don't want that.
Yeah, we prefer things to continue. Agreed. So this might be getting ahead of ourselves, but it sounds like you've got more than enough fodder to like revise your MIP and put up some proposals and gain some signal. But what I was curious about is even around the corner, the next steps from there. Do you see this treasury? Does it need a domain team or does it need a facilitator, or what's the sort of structure you think would be best for managing this?
Yeah, so currently I was quite busy with real world assets those last months. So I started to work on the strategic reserves only last week. And what I think it's more important trick we need currently is to understand the risk profile of Maker. We are making a lot of stuff, taking a lot of risk, but we don't really know what are the correlation between real world assets and crypto assets. What are the correlation between Wi-Fi? What happens if Wi-Fi disappear? What happens if USDC disappear? Well, that's the easy one, because if USDC disappear, we disappear as well, probably, most likely. So we don't have to risk currently. There is a lot of extension risk for Maker. There is a lot of stuff that can happen, and we don't have to plan for those issues because there's not much we can do. If all USDC disappear tomorrow or all ETH disappear tomorrow, well, that's a bad situation anyway. But as the DeFi ecosystem grows and grows, so the tail risk will disappear. I'm quite sure it's already disappearing. And then we will have to do just like the real world. Every bank, every company has to decide how much risk they want to take and how much capital they want to have as insurance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would encourage signaling for what we think the best parameter is there, like how much risk we think we would want to take, and just crowdsourcing that opinion. But it also might be helpful to say, I think this. Some of the questions in the chat have been like, what are your forward guidances? But I mean, obviously, you just got back to this. It's been a while. So
Yeah.
thanks for unpacking all these things where you're like, oh yeah, I should have that answer. Give me a minute. Yeah, totally. Okie dokie. I'm just going through my questions. There was one sort of like smaller risk. I wouldn't say it's a tail risk, but it's mostly like buying and selling functions in the open market. There's like, you can get sandwiched. I think Lev brought this up, but I feel like that's the kind of thing where once the implementation is sort of starting to get specced out, we'll probably have some protections. But were there any other open market things that you were kind of worried about? Like if we're reinvesting to add liquidity in these places, is there a certain risk that you sort of thought of in advance, or does that make sense?
I don't think there is a big difference between making market operation or allocating capital, for instance, in XDAI. I don't remember the exchange on XDAI, but on this exchange, and having some Uniswap LP token as collateral for loans. It's almost the same thing. It's quite sure it's more and more the same thing. So there is always some kind of protocol risk, some kind of smart contract risk. And that's why we don't want to do everything. We just need to find what are the most interesting stuff to do and focus on what is game changing. And maybe it's just to put some DAIs or USDC or ETH on Compound and get some interest. But we'll see. it's a new world, so it's not clear how that will work in 2 years.
True. That's very true. Right on. Well, I think that's all the questions. Let me check the chat one more time. Operating expenses, employments. Yeah, we did mention operating expenses, like teams, comm dev, stuff like that. That's part of it.
Yeah, that can be, or it can be an operating buffer, which is separated, because and it can be 1 month of expenses, it can be 12 months, 3 months. It really depends. It's the same thing. At the end of the day, it's all the same. Just how do you want to think about it? Maybe you want to have something different, maybe not, but yeah, I think it's if you have some. I don't know if we have 1 million of expense every month at the maker level in some years, you might want to have at least 3 million of DAI somewhere you can access quite quickly. And but yeah, that's another decision we will have to take. What is sure is that at some point you cannot say, oh, there was an emergency shutdown, so thank you all for your work, and we will not pay you at the end of the month, but keep continuing. That will not work.
True. Yeah. So we'll have to think through that scenario as well. Were there any other things you wanted to say about this, or?
I want to thank you for having the chance to present strategic reserves. I made a lot of progress just by working on the presentation. It's a breakthrough today on the accounting side of Maker, but it's too early to discuss, sadly, except if you have 2 hours left. But yeah, I expect we will move forward and see what's best for the community.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sébastien. Appreciate your time.
Thank you all.
Since I'm not the host, I'm going to have to invoke the host and ask him to say
Where is the
goodbye. Host? We should put this on YouTube and cut out this last bit. But thank you, everybody, for attending. We appreciate you, and can't wait to see the next steps on strategic reserves in the forums.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Bye-bye.